And we welcome you. We're excited to have everybody here and get set for an hour and a half of dialogue about CSR trends in mining. And I'd like to welcome you on behalf of Foresight Canada and the team here, as well as our panelists. My name is Tracy Lydiot, and I'm the Mining Innovation Project Manager here at Foresight. And we're letting some folks in. So thank you to the team in the background. We've got some folks from our events team. If you have tech issues, reach out in the chat. And before we get started, I would like, with gratitude and respect, to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from Penticton, BC, which is within the traditional Okanagan Sayilks territory. And I'd like to invite you to think about and acknowledge from whose territory you're joining today. You're welcome to use the chat to put that information in if you'd like to share. And if you need a little resource to help you find some more information, take a look at native-land.ca. And of course, with gratitude and respect, we acknowledge that the work that Foresight does cover the lands which include traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. So what is Climate Connections? So we're really here to showcase pressing real-world challenges from industry with an audience for academics, researchers, and innovators across Canada. And it's a huge, enormous challenge for industry that we're facing right now, and that we have to really align strategy and operations with the goals of creating a low carbon economy. And so as industry steps up to meet these new climate challenges, there's lots of opportunities for transition into research and impact, and also talk about how companies navigate the different levels of disclosure and reporting that are required as part of this work. And so this event series this is the last one, I believe. The events team might be able to confirm or deny that, where we're going to be presenting on climate connections through this lens and through structured conversations with folks like on our panelists today. We're going to unpack and explore these challenges and hope to spark some ideas and connections with you in the audience. So here's a little rundown on how our event is going to be happening today. So we're doing some welcome and introductions. I will be doing a slight overview of Foresight. We'll keep it to a dull roar, and then we'll hop into the industry experts. They'll get the chance to introduce themselves. And then we're really just created a lot of time for dialogue with the panelists, with some questions to dig into this topic. And then we'll open the floor up at the end for a Q&A, and then close out with a few extra slides, and then have you on your way by 2:30. So here is a little bit about Foresight. For those of you that are less familiar with us, our overarching big, hairy, audacious goal is to help Canada become the first G7 country to reach net zero. Wow, I forgot to take my speaking pills this morning. So Foresight's Canada's largest clean tech accelerator, and we really want to achieve this by bringing together partners that identify, commercialize, and adopt the clean tech technologies needed that help address today's most urgent climate challenges. And we do this through a Helix 5 model as well, where we bring together industry, government, academia, investors, and innovators to help us reach this big, hairy, audacious goal. So a little bit more about how we're planning to get there. We really see our role as fostering collaboration, breaking down silos, and helping to deliver action-oriented supports that accelerate us and Canada's innovation and adoption and growth. And we do that through 4 key ways. So we do venture acceleration through accelerator programming. We support companies in different stages and sectors to accelerate their technologies, help them scale and commercialize, and find investors. We also run innovation challenges for industry partners, and we support companies in capital attraction and export development. And we're really keen on ecosystem building and knowledge sharing. Part of the team that I'm on is the BC Net Zero Innovation Network, and our team is specifically clustered around 4 priority areas. looking at ecosystem building as well, just as an example. So we have water, mining, forest bioeconomy, and transportation. Okay. And sorry, just moving around here on my slides. So really this, I want to give a big shout out to our partners. This would not be possible today without entrepreneurship at UBC, SFU, University of Victoria, Impact Investing Hub, and McMaster University. So we're really proud of the academic partners that we have for this event. And these institutions represent over 1,000 different students and of course, tens of millions of dollars in equipment that we need as part of our transition. So I'd like to thank them for helping make sure that we have a really full room today. So I'll introduce myself really briefly. I used to be a geologist, and then I went to school and became, studied sustainability and strategy. And I have the very great fortune of being able to merge those two backgrounds to support Foresight in this role. And we also, for those of you that are just joining, we have two members of our events team from Foresight, Nisha and Astrid. So again, if you have any technical challenges with the webinar today, please reach out to them in the chat. And then I also introduce Kushi, who's on our research team for Foresight, and she will be helping us moderate the questions in the chat as well. So if you're not able to get off mute, definitely drop that in the chat function and we'll make sure to answer your questions. And with that, I would like to hand over the mic to Marilyn and have each of our panelists do a couple of minute high-level introduction of themselves and share, if you could, why you're here today and how this topic today intersects your work. Marilyn.
Thank you, Tracy. I just want to thank everybody actually for carving out the time to attend today. The only thing we have to give each other is time. So my motivation is, after having spent many years in this industry, I feel like the wise elder, and I want the next generation to make new mistakes, fail forward. I don't want it would be shameful if we repeat the mistakes of the past. Started out my career in a very much of a technical role and did a lot of mine project development and delivery around the world, various projects. And I'm now doing board work mostly. And I'm also an EIR with Foresight and enjoying that, helping the younger gen not make the same mistakes. And I'll pass it on.
Ben, I think you're up next.
Sure. Hello, everyone. My name is Ben Chalmers, and as the slide suggests, I'm the Senior Vice President at the Mining Association of Canada, where I've been for about 12 years. I come from the industry. Like Marilyn, I started off as a practitioner. I began at Myra Falls Mine on Vancouver Island, collecting water samples and doing community engagement and overseeing tailings dam management. And then moved to the Mining Association of BC, where I took up my role in policy before moving to the Mining Association of Canada in 2011. My main responsibility, among others, is the management and maintenance of towards sustainable mining, our industry's sort of national sustainability standard. And I think what really links me to this conversation is that work that is focused on helping to build a consensus on what good practice and leadership looks like between the industry and our communities of interest, and then embodying that in standards and helping to ensure that the industry is reporting transparently and credibly and using it for continuous improvement. So I'll be talking more about that later.
Excellent. Thank you, Ben. Mohammed.
Good afternoon, everybody. For those, it's afternoon. My name is Mohammed Ali. I'm the Vice President for Agnico Eagle and Sustainability and Regulatory Affairs, based in Toronto. I've started my career actually in the consulting world, where I was involved in climate inventories and greenhouse gas, and involved in sustainability before it was really coined that way. Subsequently, after doing consulting, I moved into the industry side, joined the mining sector exclusively. The last 7 years now in the industry. My main focus And where interest here for me is I've always looked at things from a life cycle perspective and trying to find ways to improve processes, and including the mining sector. And in today's subject, which I'll talk about more, is the word you might have heard, alphabet soup of all the different types of standards and performance standards. So finding ways to make meaningful impact and understanding that what you measure, what you don't measure, you can't really improve. So hoping I can shed some light into that in the world and where it's moving.
Thank you. And our final panelist, Flynn.
Don't know how much time I've screwed up here, but I lead the
Not at
consultancy
all.
for System Consulting, and been laser focused on decarbonization for large industrials for about 20 years. And yeah, really excited to have this conversation today, because I think we're kind of entering a new time period for the concerns around environment, so social governance concerns, as well as sort of making them real. So look forward to the conversation. And thanks, Tracy.
Okay, thank you, everyone. I think, Flynn, I didn't plant you as a segue, and you gave a perfect segue into, I think, what Marilyn and I have talked a lot about is this transition that is emerging and happening and that the mining industry is struggling with. And so one of the things that I'd love to ask you about is within your work at the board level, Marilyn, I think you get exposed to a lot of different perspectives. And I'm very curious what you see as the biggest trend emerging with this, with ESG and the types of reporting required for the mining industry. And also, you know, highlighting any specific pressures that might be driving these changes, I think would be important to talk about. Oh, and I think you're on mute.
Sorry. On the macro level, boards, have this oversight role. We don't, it's, sort of noses in, hands out kind of thing, right? So and I would say if you look at some of the most concerns about, what boards are looking at, they all are looking at climate externally and sort of internally. So what's your impact on the climate? And how's the climate change impacting your business? And if you think about the mining industry with all the forest fires last year and the costs that it added to your business to evacuate and not operate for weeks because so it's about at the board level really sort of understanding the risks and opportunities that ESG and sustainability and how you embed that into your business. And it's not just about risk. So it's kind of like, I look at ESG as being the new health and safety, actually. And it's what's material to your business. And so just like we used to look at safety as being sort of a policing activity, we only saw improvement. And to build on what Mohammed was saying, if you don't measure it, right? So your safety, we moved from that policing activity to holding each other accountable to be safe in the workplace, because we all deserve to go back to our families in the evening the way we came into work in the morning. And then we kind of added wellness. So it wasn't just about accidents, it was about long-term health of our employees. And then we added environment into that, and we measure it. And so this, to me, sustainability is just what you're measuring over time. So that's sort of and embedding this into everything that the company does. It's part of your culture. It's not just one person's jobs. So that's sort of one thing so how does the board hold management to account to create that culture of sustainability like we did for safety? And then the other big trend that I see happening right now is, years ago, we used to just call critical minerals, as I say, industrial minerals. They were just called industrial minerals. And it's sort of a bit of a buzzword now, but those materials were always bought in a demand pull market. Canada produces titanium oxide, we have potash, we have iron ore, and you don't see a lot of those types of mining companies just talking about investors. So if you're only talking about investors, and not talking about customers, then that's sort of a bit of a yellow flag for me. So this days where you could just supply push into the market without the transparency behind it, to me, is gone. And it's about demand pull. So your customers, which is the GMs and the Mercedes or the wind turbine manufacturers, they want to know what materials they're buying in their supply chain that meet both the technical performance, but also the environmental and social performance criteria that they've promised to their employees and to their customers. And so that's sort of where I see it really going. And that's a risk and an opportunity for everyone in the supply chain to start managing and measuring and reporting transparently.
I think those are excellent points. So I heard board accountability, and definitely I'd love to hear thoughts from Mohammed. You and I talked about materiality, and also Ben, I'd love at some point for you to talk too about how TSM is evolving and meeting expectations, because we do have, I also think, a push-pull between disclosure reporting and performance reporting, and there's a lot of juiciness to talk about in there as far as like, how do companies determine materiality? What is the difference between the push and the pull of these different markets, and like how is the industry actually grappling? Because I think all of us on our debrief had expressed that, you know, the industry is struggling to get their minds around these things. So I'm curious, who feels like they want to address that first, Ben or Mohammed? Materiality or push-pull?
I can start a little bit.
Sure.
Tracy. I'll take you down a little bit of a journey that Marilyn was going through, and I think it's a good segue into where Ben and Mac comes in with TSM. When sustainability was, the evolution of it from the health and safety, as Marilyn says, to understanding what does sustainability mean. If you asked 5 people, you'd get 6 different definitions. And then, so there was a lot of focus on the definition of sustainability. Then people started to determine metrics, and the amount of metrics that started coming out for sustainability, there were tons. And then it just started to get to a point where you're providing disclosure on over 150, 160 different things and different indicators. And from there, what happens was, there was a trend to put those sustainability reports out with tons of data. Now, what slowly is happening in the trend we're going towards is, well, what does that mean? When someone looks at a number, what is 0.05 versus 0.06? Or if you're emitting 0.39 tons of CO2 per ounce of gold, what does that mean? What does that mean by benchmark? So now the trend moving from the amount of data that was being pushed out to material data. So materiality, there's various now definitions with the materiality, but the function is, from an investor point of view, they want to know what's decision useful data. What do I need to know that's decision useful so I can make a decision if this company is doing the right thing, and what financial implications does it have? The term within materiality has 2 meanings. There's double materiality as well. So one, is it material from a perspective, is it financially decision useful? And therefore, is it a financial impact? And then the second aspect of materiality, when you hear double materiality, is this particular aspect or sustainability category impacting the planet, or in such a way that you impact the planet and the planet impacts you? You need to cover both of them. And so there's a push and pull right in their aspect. So with all that amount of data, the trend to try to make material data disclosed in a meaningful way is the future. And this is where I'm going to lob it to Ben and the work that the TSM is doing, because they're trying to create that structured framework for everyone to play in. So I'll pass it to you, Ben.
Sure, thanks. There's a lot of directions I could take this in after Marilyn and Mohammed's comments. Like, I think the trend around double materiality is hugely helpful. I think for too long we've been focused on this notion of what are material issues and sustainability, and inevitably, companies will do it on their own and it won't be credible, or they look a lot alike. And one of the advantages that I think our work around TSM has brought is an effort to build a consensus around what is material, sort of on a regional basis. Now, maybe just real quick for those that don't know it, if there are anyone out there that isn't familiar with TSM, it was launched in 2004 as a first of its kind reporting and sustainability standard for the mining industry. First of its kind in the sense that it was multi-stakeholder overseen with independent oversight and facility level reporting. It was always built on a platform to encourage continuous improvement. And, I think Maryland's invocation of the role that customers are playing here has been a really important one for us in the last little while, because when TSM began in 2004, I remember I was involved early as a practitioner, and I asked the question, was this something that could be used to share information from our customers? And I was laughed at. I was told, the supply chains are too complicated. The bottlenecks around the smelting process mean that this will always be dealt with as a commodity, never anything different. Well, now, 20 years later, this is at the forefront of our conversation. Now, I think what's important to acknowledge is that the customer is starting to drive TSM, but at the root of it is a sense that, as I said in my introduction, that this really is about a consensus of what good practice looks like, good practice and leadership, especially between affected communities and practitioners, miners. Although investors and customers are exerting more and more influence, but we are very much firm on not losing that strong link between affected communities and mining companies, because the rest is to a degree secondary. So what do I see happening? I mean, two things are happening right now that probably are worth commenting on. So one is the direction that we're going with the way standards are driving actual sort of CSR, responsible business conduct, performance, or whatever you want to call it. When I first started in 2011, we had just launched two new areas of TSM, one on biodiversity and one on safety and health, to build on the original four. And I remember a conversation shortly after that from our board saying, this is as big as TSM is ever going to get. Don't you dare start adding additional issues. And then about a few years ago, 3 years ago, there was a discussion around our board around should we add equity, diversity, and inclusion to our to TSM. It was the fastest discussion we've ever had. It was about 15 minutes. Nobody expressed an opposing view. Everyone said yes. So really that 15 minutes was around how quickly could you get around the table for everyone to express their support. And I think this comes on the back of major changes to our climate change protocol and our Indigenous and community outreach protocol in the last few years. So we've just seen great strides in the way we are building these standards to drive industry forward, to use them to build relationships with our stakeholders. I mean, the community and Indigenous relationships protocol was not that long ago changed to really put collaborative decision-making at the forefront of how companies should be working. We have built in, Marilyn talked about the evolution of safety from sort of physical safety to well-being and health. Well, now we've just added a whole section on psychological safety, which I think has been really fascinating to go through, and hopefully will help make our workplaces much more safe from an all-round perspective. So that's been a real exciting thing to see the industry embrace this as a tool moving forward, and adding more elements to it. We've also seen much more pressure around the credibility of that data and the information that's produced, and a lot of that has focused around the assurance process. So we are now, and this is actually where the customers are starting to come in. Based on customer input, we've done things like added mandatory site visits to assurance processes. We just made a decision last month to require the mines to report gaps to get to level A in TSM, which is the good performance level, and action plans to address those. We are about to, without presupposing a board decision, there will be a decision in front of our board in June to give our multi-stakeholder panel, our community of interest panel, a formal decision-making role in TSM. So those are the kinds of things I think that are driving performance today and driving that continuous improvement. Mohammed talked about, so the 150 different things that companies are being asked to report on, and that's another trend that we're in the middle of dealing with. While TSM was the first on the block to require that mine site level reporting and all of the other things that I mentioned, today we're not the only one. There's a huge fragmentation in standards today, and we have been hard at work over the last year, with probably another year to go, on a major project with ICMM, World Gold Council, the Copper Mark, and ourselves to replace our 4 standards with a single new standard. You know, not to consolidate the industry to a single standard overall, but to say we're going to take our off the board and replace it with one, which I think is very exciting. And for me, it's very rewarding to see that TSM is forming the basis of that. That it will be multi-level based, and it will have a lot of other functions that TSM has, including the focus on national panels, national multi-stakeholder conversations. There will be an international board, multi-stakeholder board, but we are emphasizing the need for that level of discussion at the national level, which I think is really inherent to supporting the work that folks like Mohammed and Marilyn are doing around things like double materiality, and rather than sort of having every company decide what's material on their own, to try to build a dialogue around that. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in if I can, Tracy, and is that all right? Okay. I just wanted to talk about, maybe there are people on the phone, on this call might not understand what materiality is. I didn't, I was a technical person. And it's sort of only until you sort of do finance and board work do you start kind of understanding some of that lingo. But, this is why I think people are finding, like Mohammed said, the myriad of reporting, it's actually reporting fatigue. And it's hard for investors to take one number from one framework and look at a metric from another framework and actually compare apples with apples, so they know, especially even at the board, from an acquisition point of view, if you're acquiring another company or you're selling an asset. And so materiality is sort of, if I think about the UN SDGs, right, there's 17 goals. Well, life below water may not be material to your company. If you are a mining company in, say, the prairies, for instance, right, and you're actually doing helium mining, like you're drilling for helium. We can't make semiconductors without helium. So if you're a company, but life like in the air, right, is important to you because you're producing a gas. But if you're a shipping company, life below water is probably material to your company because it's a high risk. So I think that's how I kind of think about materiality. And the double materiality would be like, if someone, if you're a mining company, forest fire can affect you. But if you're clearing brush for your drilling program and you're actually leaving fuel in the forest, you're contributing to the potential of forest fire. So that's sort of the double materiality. The one thing I did want to say too is I actually did the TSM verification training simply to inform my board work. What should I be asking management to be measuring if I want that company to be moving towards more sustainability and starting that journey? So that's, just a few last comments on that.
Can I add also something, Tracy, a little bit on the thing that what Ben talked about and the convergence of those standards? I wanted to also let people know who may not realize in the mining sector, that convergence is an important step because unlike many other sectors, a mining sector or resource sector is unique because you have a finite life, you have a finite asset, and a lot of the standards that are being done at the international, let's say global standards, there's various things, don't factor in that uniqueness of mining. So for example, on target setting, they just assume a linear process forever and a linear reduction. And it doesn't work that way for mining. So it's very important that what the mining sector is trying to do to adopt those sustainability standards in a way that the mining industry can use. We're not a bottle manufacturing company that will make X bottles per year and finding efficiencies year over year. It's just a different animal. And then on the reporting, there's also two types of disclosures, and that's at some point maybe we can touch on it because it's a topic of its own. There's performance standards and then there's disclosure standards, and they both need to exist in some capacity. One drives performance and one drives disclosure, and that is another emerging topic at some point to talk about.
Yeah, I think it's sort of a top-down, bottom-up approach.
Yeah, and they're going to meet somewhere.
It's a bit messy right now, don't you think?
It's a bit messy, especially with the new SEC rules just came out. And then the CSSB, which I'm on the board of, just released their exposure draft. TNFD is doing their thing. So there's quite a lot of stuff going on. So that is a package on its own.
I'm going to put my acronym police hat on and ask for you to expand on the acronyms if you can in the chat as you're speaking about them. I think that would be helpful for folks on the call if they're not super familiar with this sector. And you brought up so many amazing points. And one of the things I think, Mohammed, that really resonated with, I resonated with what you said, which is how do you define sustainability? And it's a huge challenge. And there's so many different perspectives that we're talking about. So we are talking about, there's the perspective of somebody that works inside of a company that is required to report. There's the perspective Ben and Marilyn have been touching on it, the supply chain perspective. So if you are a customer of metals and commodities, then you have your own due diligence process. You're trying to understand what are the carbon emissions related to the commodity that you're buying. Is there child or slave labor, for example? Is the mining company doing a good job with how they're reclaiming projects? Are they handling their operations properly? Like, it's so multifaceted, and I love that you brought forward also the materiality, because I think one thing that I've seen in my career in the mining industry is just a huge opportunity to greenwash. And so I love that we're talking about materiality, and a couple of points I'd like to touch on what you just brought forward, Mohammed, and also to talk to Flynn a little bit about would you be able to address the operational side of how do companies struggle with operationalizing these? And maybe we can start with you, Mohammed, and really just crack open that nut and talk about the different types of disclosures and reporting that is required, and just shed some light on that, and definitely talk about, and I know, talk about the liability side, which is coming in now with the SEC rules.
Sure. I can talk a little bit about operationalizing some of this in the data. I think the thing is when the TSM standards, and the beauty of those standards are that there's always a continuous improvement component in there. They've identified the material aspects of mining and put it out there before anyone else did. And I remember I took one of the first trainings at TSM way back with Mac, and there was a lot of data, and it was like, how are we going to do this? And the intent was not to make it not to make it as a separate thing. It was to institutionalize it in your organization. So a lot of the information we have, and I say finding a way to make it as part of business, driving business decision making, et cetera, is a challenge. We're still not perfectly there. We still have databases all over the place. So that's the mechanics component of it. We have Excel spreadsheets, we have softwares, we have financial softwares, we have Power BI tools that are bringing it all together. Getting that data is complicated, and that's a topic of its own, and it's a data management issue. However, ultimately, the goal of these things are you thinking about these things? Are you managing them? And what are the costs? And the cost was the new element that's now driving some of these things, because like, okay, well, if this is costing us money, how much is it costing? What's the risk? What's the material risk? In terms of the data, Tracy, I could say that there's no perfect solution out there yet. We don't know one. And if it does, by the time the software is ready, things have moved on. We have found at the moment that we have figured out a way to manage the data as we can. because we have a system, but we have to find ways to keep adapting new things. And that's the hardest part for us. When something new emerges, we have to go back and figure out where to get and how to put the stuff in. And then if you want the financial part, that's a whole different animal.
Yeah, well, let's definitely talk about that. Flynn, did you have any comments about the work and challenges that you're seeing on the operational side, just while we're here?
Yeah, no, I definitely see that. Exactly points to it's very difficult to put quantify these improvements, especially that they seem to be ever increasing as well. So the challenges abound. I think generally there's a huge amount of work the mining sector is doing. In fact, I think the mining sector is actually commitment here. It's making leaps and bounds. It seems like there's also not a lot of good clarity on what you are supposed to be reporting on as well. I mean, the TSM is great, but others, definitely, things like the GHG protocol do not give you specific understandings for exactly how to set targets and how to treat acquisitions and divestitures. It's sort of still some gray areas, as Merlin pointed to. Still in the kind of wild west.
Flynn, it might help if we're having a little hard time hearing you. I think we heard most of what you said. Maybe your Wi-Fi connection's on vacation with you. If you want to try turning off your video, it might increase your bandwidth there.
I'll do that.
Okay. So yeah, hearing a lot of challenges around adoption. Mohammed, amazing point, the cost to manage. I think that in the past, and I think a word that came forward with you, Ben, was reluctance. And I really heard that in your comments about like, no, this is as big as this is ever gonna get. Like there's a lot of reluctance because I feel like when you think about sustainability, it literally covers everything. And you brought up a great point as well, Mohammed, that we're not a bottle manufacturing industry. Like literally every single commodity where you're mining it from, whether it's from virgin rock or waste rock, has a completely different set of contextual aspects that you have to think about with location, geography, staffing, communities. Like you can't just plop down a nice little factory and have the same process all around the world. So the cost to manage is really interesting to me and is adaptive. The need to adapt your operations and just constantly go through that process of evaluating, are you doing the right things? What kind of reporting do you need to do now? Is obviously very cost prohibitive in times. And do you feel like that's stopping some companies from reporting? And like maybe we can use that as a bit of a segue into what are the things now where there's real risk and liability from a financial perspective if you're not reporting?
I would love to answer this too, but
Sure. Okay.
Whoever wants to go first.
I'll start with the initial part on the cost and the burden, and then I'll pass it to others as well. But as a company, let me step back. As a sector, mining, and just for the audience, there is a misnomer that there's this assumption that the mining industry is potentially either laggard or there's not been as much innovation. I'm hoping that perception changed, but to what Ben's saying, the mining sector has been the forefront of a lot of this stuff before other sectors. We've tackled biodiversity before anybody else. I actually did my first greenhouse gas job out of school as a student for Alcan as a mining sector. I learned the GHG protocol. The mining sector was heavily involved. So if one of the takeaways for the audience members are the mining sector is actually quite ahead in driving a lot of the sustainability. The second thing on the cost and what people may not realize, because we're not bottle manufacturing, each mine is different, and therefore each ore body is different, and that means each mine has a different life. So some may have a 4-year life or a 6-year life, some may have a 30-year life. That means the return on investment of certain technologies isn't completely applicable to every scenario. You may not be able to deploy a certain technology on site 1, but you can on site too. So the second point I want to get across for the audience is, oh, X so-and-so's got a mine technology or they've got a wind turbine. Why isn't all of them doing it? It doesn't work that way for all the mines, just because they might have a shorter mine life. And therefore, you know, in your bottle manufacturing, you come up with a robotic, some solution, everybody can just jump in and do it. The third, which people don't realize, is we are a commodity business that particularly that is, you know, there is a supply and demand, but let's say I'm in the gold business, and the gold price, there's a price set by the commodity of gold, what it's traded at. So if I was a, let's say hypothetically, bottle manufacturing, if I wanted to make a green bottle, I can actually increase and give a premium on that price and pass that cost to the customer, because I'm like, hey, I'm making a greener product, and they can absorb some of those costs because they're trying to target a demographic that may be more investor green conscious. Versus in the mining, you really can't. You really can't just say, you know what, our gold is greener, so we're going to sell it at a premium. Because it's a commodity. So with all those constraints and still trying to lead sustainability, I want the audience to know that it's the constraints we have are unique and makes it difficult. And therefore, the burden of cost, because the metal sector is so volatile up and down, the burden of incorporating something isn't just a simple solution, because there's new assets coming online, coming offline. So I'll stop there and I'll let Marilyn continue where I left off.
I'm like biting at the bit to jump in. So I'm going to be a contrarian here, so we're not all this happy. I'm tired of hearing the word commodity, and the energy transition requires non-commoditized specialty materials that your customers will pay a premium for to secure their supply chains. And so and this is what we've done with industrial material, minerals. You don't hear a lot of junior miners running around going, I've got an iron ore body to sell you, right? Because the midstream is well developed, and the steel companies in North America want to secure their supply chain. And because they're selling to their customers, Mercedes, GM, and GM wants to know what the carbon footprint is of the steel, it's forcing the steel companies to start becoming green. So I'm sort of seeing this change happening where the midstream is being developed. And it's these uncommoditized specialty material, rare earth elements for high strength permanent magnets needed for the high efficiency electric motors as we're going through this energy transition. So I wanted to jump on this. What is the cost of not managing it? And we don't say that about our children, right? What's good for people and planet is good for long-term profit in this age of disruption that we're sort of in. And we wouldn't think about that, like not investing in our children, because we're not going to see them actually graduate from university for 20 years. So I think there's a different mindset around boards that are thinking longer term, because profit at all costs is not acceptable anymore. And I could say to you that First Quantum is a perfect example. They did not invest in the social, and it came back to bite them. And there's a lot. And think about Alcan, your example of Alcan, Mohammed. It's not a commodity because there's all sorts of grades in the aluminum industry. The midstream is so well developed, and there's so many different applications of different kinds of aluminum, and it's a demand pull type industry, not a supply push. So I'll leave it
Except
there.
for gold.
I'll break in there if I can. Try to be a little provocative here. I mean, all that Marilyn said is true. That's the direction we're heading in. The problem is we're not there yet, and that is evidenced by what's happening right now with nickel prices. After China has dumped cheap nickel from Indonesia and China on the market, and we see it with rare earths constantly, where we are trying to get rare earth streams up and running in the Western world. And every time a new operation or processing plant gets close, the market is manipulated, which is a problem. And it's preventing, I think, the change that Marilyn is talking about from accelerating. And so we're stuck in this, and I think Mohammed called it right. It's messy right now. We are many of us are working to help embody the transition that Marilyn spoke about, but we have these headwinds that we're trying to overcome. I wanted to kind of come back to that reporting bit that Mohammed was talking about as well. And I mean, I think he's right. I mean, it's not a case of are we reporting enough? It's we're reporting too much right now. We need to streamline that. But there are challenges. Mohammed talked about decision-ready data earlier, and he and I were at a dialogue last year that we organize every year in Montreal. This one was in Montreal, and we were talking about this notion with our investors. It's a dialogue between mining companies and institutional investors. And we were talking, we use this in part to promote TSM, towards sustainable mining, to the investment community. And we got into this discussion where the investors were saying standards like that are all well and good, and we'll use them. But what we really want is the raw data. We want your raw data. And it was Mohammed's boss, Carol, that after this went around for a little bit said, are you sure? Are you sure you want our raw data? Do you know what that is? Like daily composite water samples, individual daily sightings of caribou, metal concentrations in individual tree and vegetation samples. Are you sure you want that? What are you going to do with it? And they said, no, that's not what we want. So there's this mismatch between, and I think the notion of decision-ready data is a really important area to explore. You know, what do the investors need for decision-ready data? And they need to recognize that that's different than people like Mohammed and Marilyn, who are, you know, in executive and corporate services or board services, versus what are the people on the ground at the mines actually using for decision-ready data, and how do we do that in a rational way? And then the last point I'd make before I turn it back over, you know, the mining industry is a leader in this space of reporting, and one of the pieces of evidence for that is our partners that help us organize this dialogue are a firm called Milani, which is a company that helps companies align their ESG disclosure with the needs of investors, and they've been doing some research on how companies are moving to double material reporting. And in a report they recently released earlier this year, they found that instances of companies reporting double materiality for mining is 20 to 1 times higher than any other industry, which amazed me. I couldn't believe how much our industry has embraced this. Now, 20 to 1, it's not like there are hundreds of companies reporting this. It's still a relatively small number, but the ratio is notable.
Thank you, Ben. That's a really great stat to bring forward and highlight. And before we get along too far, and I actually think it melds quite well with a little bit what we're talking about and where we could go with the conversation for the next few minutes before we open up to general Q&A. I do see a question here from Kevin, who's asking, are mining companies in Canada reporting against TSM as its own framework? For example, in sustainability reports, you have SASB section, TNFD section, GRI section, and TSM section. So I think this, if we can unpack this a little bit, it might also segue nicely into what Mohammed was bringing forward earlier and what you're just touching on as well, which is the investor side of this conversation, and teasing out the fluff a little bit on how these things are different and how they intersect with each other.
Sure, and that's probably a question to me more so than the others. So TSM is its own reporting platform. We consolidate we don't consolidate, it's all individual data points, but we bring all of our members' data together and report it through TSM. It's a performance standard. So we're reporting on whether criteria have been met and assigning performance letter grades to that. All of these other things in many ways are reporting standards. And so we are not prescriptive about the kinds of data that's reported. We give our members space to decide if they're using SASB or some other, or GRI or anything else. So they complement each other, but you won't see TSM reported in one of these others, or some companies are doing it in their sustainability reports, but we have a centralized data portal. We are also working on a new digital trusted credential that could see this linked to or give more control over companies to pass this through the supply chain. I know that was something else we were going to touch on, but we can maybe come back to that later if we have time.
Yeah, absolutely. And Mohammed, I wanted to ask you, do you want to address the the task force for financial disclosure with climate change risks and the SEC rules that have come out. Is that a good space to talk about this right now? And then we definitely want to talk more about the transparency of data and the digital trust, Ben.
Sure. I can touch on it a little bit, and then if we get more time or more specific questions, depending on the interests of the audience here. But as Ben said, that there's a TSM framework, and it's based on performance, and it's really the only way to really look at mines within each other, the mines, and it's not supposed to be a competition of any kind, but it's trying to come up with a performance standard. Are you doing well? Because the first question or first notion I said is, well, you have a number. Does that mean it's good or bad? So the TSM tried to put successfully a framework that has a performance standard, and you get some scoring and assurance done on it. These other, the disclosure standard is not a performance standard. It's a disclosure standard. So when I said the US SEC, which is the United States Securities Exchange mentioned, I think earlier, Commission. Then there's the Canadian CSA, which is the Canadian Securities Administration. Those are financial reporting disclosures. So what the financial community is asking for is, okay, you've now disclosed all of your information on sustainability and TSM, but an investor, to the point that Ben mentioned when we were in this meeting, have a broad portfolio. They're looking at mining as one of the investing area, but they might be looking at the airline sector or the automotive or whatever. So they wanted something that they can compare. So the financial component came in, and the nuts and bolts of it is that they would like to understand the financial impact associated to your sustainability impact or impact to you. So where this all fits in with TNFD and TCFD was a task force for climate financial disclosures, which the TSM has adopted the elements that make it relevant to the mining and has been incorporated into the new climate standards for TSM. TNFD is still out in terms of it's relatively new, and it's the task force for nature-related financial disclosure, which basically is trying to say every industry or every person has a dependency on nature. Could be water, could be air, whatever it may be. Your dependency on that nature. Your dependency on that nature, what is the financial implication to it? And that's what they're trying to put forward. And so I think that, and then the other components of the GR, et cetera, are more performance-based. So those are the kind of fundamental difference. So that financial disclosure allows the investors to say, okay, what's the financial liability or opportunity associated to your dependency on climate or nature? And the TNFD one is still early. It's a little bit of a wait and see. They've developed a draft, and let's see where it goes.
Thank you for sharing that. With our last 6 minutes, I feel like before we open it up for questions, a lot of what we're talking about is information overwhelm. How do you define what's important in materiality? To whom is it material? You've got a number of different actors, whether you're inside a company or outside, trying to evaluate. And also a lot about transparency. So I think in the past, Mohammed, you did touch on it, and I'm glad you brought it forward, that this industry has a very bad reputation for potentially behaving poorly in a manner of different ways, which I don't think is true. And the challenge is transparency and information. And I think that the TSM has done such an excellent job in creating that structure for gathering information on the mine site level. And what I'd love to talk about is how as human beings and as people that are all committed to moving the sustainability needle forward, how do we weave all of these pieces together around transparency and trust? Because a lot of it is also trust. Like we're talking about, do we trust the information that's coming out of these organizations and the need to have these standards? And I'd love for you to share, Ben, a little bit about the Energy and Mines Digital Trust Initiative, because I think it's really important. And I personally think that that's a trend of where we're going as well with this work.
Sure, thanks, Tracy. This has been a wonderful project, and just before I begin to describe it, just a credit to the BC government that began this work and invited us in. But in order for data to be trusted, there are several components. I mean, the first several components we put a lot of effort into TSM over the years: that multi-stakeholder governance, the clear, transparent requirements in the standard, the solid assurance process that can be credible. But then it's a case of, how do you transmit the data? How do you make sure that the data is going through the supply chain or to investors or to local communities in a way that can be trusted in its integrity? So the BC government started to do some work around digital credentials for individual ID purposes, for professional accreditations, and they started to ask, what could we do with our industries around this? And the mining department, the energy and mines, or whatever it's called now, reached out to me and said, we think we might want to do something with TSM. And so the idea here is, just like your Apple phone or your Android phone, you've got a wallet, a digital wallet in there, and companies will have these digital wallets under this tool, and like your iPhone, it has your credit card in there, and you can use that to pay, because merchants and you have confidence that that's a secure way of storing your credit card and using that to pay. And so the idea here is that a company under this credentialing program can create a TSM report under the TSM governance structure, and we sign off on that. It can go to an assurance provider, a verifier, who will add their digital signature to it to say, yes, I have verified these under the terms of TSM, and this is an accurate reflection of performance. That can then go back to the company as a verified credential, and it can come back to TSM for reporting purposes. But then the next step that we're working on right now is that they will be able to pass it either directly to their customers or through the smelters, who can aggregate them together and move them through the supply chain. And so right now, the benefit here is that when Mohammed reports Agnico Eagle scores to us, they sit on our webpage, and I can tell you the number of hits on the data part of our website is not as high as we would like. So the idea is to mobilize this so that Mohammed can send this to the refiners that are dealing with his gold concentrate, and that they can pass it on. And so that really, to us, sort of rounds out all of this effort that we've been putting into making sure that the standard itself and the company's performance has credibility and integrity, and now we can share it on a trusted basis. So we did actually, and I'll just conclude by saying we did 2 pilots. 2 companies used this in December for their last year's reports. It worked very, very well, and so now we're opening it up to all of our companies this year on an optional basis, and we're hoping that it will become our standard way of doing things, perhaps as soon as 2025.
Oh, that's fantastic. Thank you, Ben. And, just to bridge the gap or just really land the plane about this from a consumer perspective, I'm when I was in school studying sustainability, it was also a hard knock to get companies to think about their scope 3 emissions, let alone scope 1 and 2. And so I feel like this is also a result of companies like you mentioning, like Tesla, like Google, other large commodity or large companies that are using these industrial metals and materials in their manufacturing supply chains are starting to go backwards into where is it coming from, how is it produced, and that's where these 2 things are meeting, which is really, I think, really exciting to me. And finally, for those of us who have been around for a while and speaking loudly about these topics, it's actually really quite exciting to see these 2 things merging from the opposite directions. So with that, I would love to use our last 25 minutes or so to open up for questions if the panelists are ready and feel energetic. And I see a few familiar faces on here, so I'm excited to see what emerges. Does anybody have any questions? And if you do, you can either put your hand up and come off mute or drop it in the chat.
I'm just going to say while we're waiting, I don't know if I wanted to Is it okay, Tracy? Are you okay with just, I wanted to say to Ben that policy is needed with respect to the manipulation of the markets. And it's China is playing, changing the rules of the game.
You won't get any argument from me. Unfortunately, it's international policy that's needed.
Yes.
Can...
But I say that, but there's other things that we can do. And one of the hats that I do wear is I'm working with the Canadian Critical Minerals and Materials Alliance, and one of our members produces gallium. And we had a gallium shortage last summer, and they're barred from importing electronic waste. And it's not a mining story. They're actually using the circular economy to build their processes, and they actually moved a plant from the state, expanded it, and they're only running at 30% capacity because they're barred from, because of an import restriction, that they cannot import the raw materials needed to run their plants. So, it goes both ways, right? Kind of thing. I think we have a question, Trace.
Good point, Marilyn. Thank you. So Tony, thank you for asking. So we've got decommodifying metals and making sustainability more trackable. What do you all think the advantages and issues are around digital certificate solutions in this space? Similar to what Trax is building. And I see Ahmed on the call here, who is the founder and CEO of Trax. For those of you that aren't familiar, it's maybe you can hop off mute and explain.
Yeah, hello everybody. Thank you so much, Tracy, and thank you so much, Tony, for mentioning Trax. Yeah, and Trax is actually developing a digital product passport for mining and textile industries, and we would like, to our technology would be, developed on top of BC Digital Trust infrastructure. So it's quite interesting that the government of BC has initiated and launched that project, and we believe that with the trend of European Union mandates, United Nations Transparency Protocol, and also the membership of BC government in Global Battery Alliance, it's the best time to start working on digital product passports in BC. And yeah, so far we have done a project in the mining sector, in BC mining sector, and we would love to have more projects, more pilot projects, and so on. So yeah.
Maybe I can speak to that. First of all, Ahmed, I don't know Trax. We have worked with others like Optel. One of the things so first of all, our commitment around TSM is that we have decided not to build our own chain of custody system. We have committed to working with anyone that wants to build mechanisms that can transmit our data. We have, and I don't know the nature of your technology, so take this answer for what it's worth. We have made a decision to work with the Digital Trusted Credential project from BC because it's open source, and it's working with a UN standard around data and digital trusted credentials. I guess the first part of the answer is I think this area has huge value, huge importance. It's the way in which we're going to connect with our customers and through that midstream in an efficient way. So either we will happily work with you on your, to make sure our data can feed into your system, or if it's open source, then we can probably collaborate a little more directly around our digital trusted credential work.
Yeah, that would be amazing. Thanks so much.
Can I just comment a little bit on that?
Please.
So what we didn't touch on, and I sort of saw a little bit because we were talking about performance standards and disclosure standards, and the way that I differentiate, I love analogies if you haven't figured that out already. So a performance standard might mean that I'm designing a table, but it only has 2 legs. So it's not going to perform very well. But if I disclose to the public that it actually has 2 legs, I've met the disclosure standard, but if there was a performance standard for a table, it probably wouldn't pass. And so, and this is where I think people get things sort of mixed up. So what we haven't really talked about is ISO standards. And a lot of those are technical and performance standards. And something that I'm sort of involved with globally is Canada doesn't have a seat at these table. And what we're seeing is we call them FEOIs, or foreign entities of interests, now have, because as long as you're a member company of these performance standard international ISO, everybody heard about ISO, any country can go and propose to have a standard. And what's quietly happened for quite a few years is there's a lithium standard, and there's a nickel standard, or there's a graphite standard, and a company puts forward a proposal to make a standard around that. And then if your voice as your country or the West, is not at the table, that standard becomes the standard that everybody trades by. So if you meet this technical standard, it includes how it's packaged. And if you're a country, think of lithium, for example, they put everything in those standards, and it might make it easy. It's just human nature, right? If you're at the table and you're making the standards, it's like writing minutes of a meeting, right? You kind of create history. And so we're seeing that they're putting standards in for like the wood that the pallets are made out of, that some of this stuff is shipped on. And it's hard for some countries to actually meet that standard because they can't get the wood. But it's easier for other countries too. So there's some really interesting things. It's like the Hunger Games for materials right now, but if we have a voice at the table and the right people at the table, it's going to take a village. That's like, I'm very hopeful when we've got good people like, Ben and Mohammed, and people volunteering their time to do a lot of this stuff.
Thanks, Marilyn. That's a great point. Also that I take a lot of comfort from as well. When my sustainability heart gets bogged down, I think about folks like yourself and those on this call that are just so interested and passionate and doing amazing work. And speaking of amazing work, we have a question about the role of various government actors and what they have in the movement towards more sustainable mining and material creation, from Tamara Connell. And she's asking, what role do you see NGOs playing in the shift to a net zero or more sustainable future for the industry?
It won't happen without NGOs. It hasn't happened to date without NGOs. I think, our own work on TSM, that was one of the first things that we decided, was that we needed a multi-stakeholder body to oversee it. NGOs of all types, whether advocacy NGOs like Mining Watch or partner NGOs like Conservation International, for instance, or that work with us to conserve land. It takes all sorts to help push the industry and help give us the people and organizations to collaborate with. So it's not an option. This industry is going to work with civil society to advance itself. And I think that's a really, really good thing. There are some that are, that infuriate us, and those are just as important as those that we can work with, because they all push us forward. I'd also maybe just like to quickly react to the graph that was just posted as well. I just came from a conference in Norway earlier this week, and a similar slide was shown, except that it was framed a little differently. It was the percentage of those types of minerals that were produced in democratic countries versus autocracies. And just like this graph shows, a surprising amount of our global mineral supply chain comes from countries where there are autocratic governments in place, which is certainly something that I think many of Marilyn's comments today were alluding to as a problem, and one that we need to make sure that we are trying to address.
That's a great point, Ben, and something that Mohammed and I had touched on during our preparation for this call, which is this even needed? Like, there's arguments that there's arguments, I think, for and against creating all this effort and the cost to companies to do this, especially I think in the light of what was shared earlier about how the market has its own response. And it doesn't matter if it's metals that are coming from a country that we may or may not like or deem responsible versus just the market response. So maybe that's a question we could close out with is, do you feel like this is still worth it? And what are the ways that we can help the mining industry deal with the volatility and market responses? Go, Marilyn.
Okay, most materials aren't traded on a market. This is what people don't understand. We keep seeing everything through a gold lens. We keep seeing everything through a mining lens. And I don't want to slam our industry, but we don't do that with iron ore. And that's a basic building block of society. We don't do that with titanium. We don't do that with many of our non-commoditized. So if we need to get commodities out of because commodities, we call it the commodity super cycle, right? And so the days of when we could make bread and take it to the market, I can always relate everything to food, and take it to the market and be sold out by 11 o'clock, right? Are done and over with. The markets are changing to more demand pull, way more demand pull, because your customers is saying, is that bread vegan? Is it organic, certified organic? Did your children help you make it and you kept them away from school? Right? So your customers, and you don't need to take it to the market because they can find you online. And so if you can prove that you're a corporately and socially responsible supplier of that material, and you partner with your customer, and they will tell you what you need to be mining 5 years from now for materials that aren't even invented yet. And so it's about being hooked to your customers. We can't control the markets. Find your niche customer. And like, I literally had a conversation with someone from one of the major automotive suppliers. And he said, we bought a bunch of material and we don't know what to do with it, because everybody's scrambling. So they need us as much as we need them. And it's not about investors. This energy transition is the reindustrialization of the West after 70 years of deindustrialization. And
So
we're going to do it.
Thanks,
Marilyn,
Marilyn.
I think Marilyn raises an interesting point there.
Mhm.
You know, we do see today many of the automotive companies starting to source raw materials directly themselves. And that's because the midstream is not there yet. And we are missing the traders. We're missing the stage in the manufacturing process from refiners through to OEMs. And they have a huge role to play in helping to move this material through the supply chain in a way that the kinds of credentials that I talked about earlier can make them to all the way to BMW or Ford or Tesla.
And I also think, oh, sorry, Mohammed, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to add on that topic of the materials that are the non-commodity materials. The question I'd ask, let's say your washing machine, like Samsung, when you makes a washing machine, there's various metals that go into it, from aluminum, steel, copper. If they owned, when you buy that washing machine, you own all that material. When I dispose of that washing machine, in theory, I've bought the aluminum, steel, but I didn't want to buy aluminum or steel. I wanted to buy washing. I bought a product. So if Samsung owned the materials or had to take it, but would they design their units differently? Would they design it differently? Therefore, copper is always copper. Can they reuse the heat exchangers? Can they use the real steel drums again if they had a reverse supply chain? And if we're all nodding, I think that's where some of the things have to go down to the downstream product manufacturers, to where Ben's saying automotive, if they're building a vertical supply chain, if they had their own materials and they got it back, they might be designing more, because I think there's a lot of metal that ends up in, I don't have the statistic, but I'm assuming it ends up in secondary uses, et cetera, or non-value uses in the secondary stream, and we're losing material there.
It's a really interesting point, and I talked about the midstream and the work that needs to be done there, but the other thing, too often we're saying, the answer is recycling, and we see Apple saying, we're not going to source raw material, working to move away from raw materials. We're going to use 100% recycled materials in as many things as we can. Now, in Apple's case, they have done exactly what Mohammed's talking about, but too often the answer is, well, just increase recycling. But there are no standards for recycling. There are no oversight of labor practices and environmental practices in many of the parts of the world that really are the aggregators of recycled metal materials, and that's a problem as well.
I think it's oh, go ahead, Marilyn.
Sorry, I sometimes we talk about sector, and so this is a lens that I have that's I think a little unusual. We always talk about sector regulation, and we actually don't talk about professional self-regulation. And I think they can work very well together. Sector regulation usually lags. Something bad has to happen for them to change a regulation. Whereas if you actually have strong professional self-regulation, you leave it in the hands of the practitioners who have made typically a commitment to be ethical or to do the right thing. So as technology changes, and so I'm talking about like professional engineers, professional planners, accountants, all these regulated, you think about healthcare professionals, right? You can't regulate everything that they do in a day, but you give them the freedom to make the right decision that a prudent practitioner would do in a similar situation. And I think we don't talk enough about how to strengthen our self-regulated professions so that that person has agreed to behave, because if we're talking about social behavior, right? Behave in a certain way that's good for the public interest. And I think that's a tool in our toolbox that we're not leveraging to the max right now, because I think engineers have a large role to play in the climate change. So when somebody reports a greenhouse gas calculation, and they're part of, just like if an accountant reports a number, if they're committing fraud, their profession holds them accountable, right? So if somebody's greenwashing, they should be held accountable. But if there isn't demand side legislation saying engineers have to do this type of work, or people that are science literate, environmental professionals, people that understand math, so I think that I suspect that might be coming.
I'll unpack that question over there that says, very valid point. Very few metals are actually recycled. Metals are very recyclable, but your aluminum can, if I were just to brought this, that's always my mantra. This product, I'm not doing product placement, but there's 3 alloys that make this thing. The problem we have is we make too many alloys and too many disaggregate. So the one alloy is the sheet around, the second alloy is the top and bottom lid, and the third is that cap that opens up. You can't recycle this because now you're mixing 3 different alloys, so it doesn't go back to its virgin material as easily. So this is just a simple can. If Coca-Cola owned this aluminum and they wanted it back, they would design this can very differently for 100% recycling.
It's such a great point, Mohammed, and something that, I studied when I was studying sustainability, and that I think about a lot is what we obviously don't have a lot of time to touch on today, and maybe it's a good follow-up. There's 2 points that I kind of wanted to bring up and follow up is about, the first one is about companies going up their supply chain and wanting to find out where those materials are coming from. Also, is there a great opportunity here to work in more partnership around co-development of projects with First Nations and communities, for example, as a new way of thinking about how to do this industry, to your points, Ben and Marilyn. And then the other point that you just brought forward, Mohammed, is the design for disassembly. I think engineers have a huge role to play in rethinking. If you think about I've always been a huge advocate of metals and sharing the message of like our common way of life right now, and the quality of life that we enjoy is not possible without mined materials. And there's so much embedded carbon and energy in waste rock projects and waste rock and tailings and even just metals that are in circulation. And we have to think differently about closing the loop on them. And exactly what you're sharing, if Coca-Cola owned those metals or Samsung owned the metals in their washing machines, they certainly would want them back, which completely changes the whole business model for how you sell goods and services into the market.
And it
I
changes
can
the push and pull system that Marilyn talked about, because now the pull is different, because the pull is coming because the consumers keep wanting more of those products and keeps driving it completely changes the economics here.
Tracy, can I react to John's comment, the one around the blood diamonds and tantalum?
Yes, thank you. I was just going back there.
It's an area that we in the standard space struggle with regularly. I mean, I think there is enough conventional wisdom out there now that divesting completely from countries with weak governance is not the way forward. It does more harm than it does solve issues. So, I mean, conventional thinking through things like the UN guiding principles is that we need to stay engaged and help build governance and institutions and good practice. One of the things that we've been thinking about quite a lot with TSM, as we've shared TSM with other countries, and I mentioned the emphasis on national panel, stakeholder panel dialogue as the basis for TSM, is do you set standards globally at a consistent level, realizing that if you set standards for Canada, Europe, Australia, United States, you're setting them at a very high level, it's going to be a big lift for some places to get there. And finding that balance of setting standards that can be implemented internationally at a consistent basis, but do so in a way that can bring everyone up in a measured and a way that they can actually respond to is a challenge that we're trying to address head on with things like our convergence work and the growth of TSM internationally. So maybe just to John, it's something that is on the top of our minds lately with standards every day.
I wanted to just address, sort of there was that stakeholder, NGO comment, and I see them as part of the stakeholders of the companies that like, not all the NGOs might be, but it's what's material to your company. And if you think of what happened with First Quantum, were they engaging with NGOs in Panama? And if they had invested, maybe they wouldn't have lost their value. Right? So it's, and the other thing that I just wanted, sometimes people say we can't afford to do something, but sometimes you have to think, what can we afford not to? And what's your risk tolerance? Right. So should I buy a bike helmet? Right. Drive my motorcycle without a helmet? Right. But I did want to say that I made the same statement about aluminum. I was shocked to understand how much aluminum was actually recycled. Mini mills in the steel industry have always been about recycling steel. And the Blue Box program helped to enhance that. And at PDAC this year, Rio Tinto announced that they are not going after natural sources of bauxite, but they're going to be purchasing aluminum recycling, like they've acquired aluminum recycling businesses so that they can really embrace the circular economy to meet the needs of their customers, because that's what their customers are asking for. They don't want to see bauxite from, because we don't make it in North America, but it's usually bauxite comes from often conflict zones in the world. And they want to reduce their geopolitical risk. So it's kind of, so by recycling, it's actually good for business.
That's a great point, Marilyn. Thank you. Also, just to share with the audience, we're in the final phases of formalizing our partnership on some projects with Geoscience BC, which is a science-based organization here in British Columbia. We have over 1,000 abandoned mine sites, finished and abandoned mine sites in BC. And we are going to be working with Geoscience BC to map out those tailings and waste rock piles exactly for this purpose, for understanding what metals and materials are contained in there, what types of environmental problems are involved as far as remediation, biodiversity, and water, and what's some value that might be available for innovators to come in and work with the companies that own or the government that own those sites. So I think there's some really exciting things happening on the waste rock circular economy side of this story that unfortunately we can't touch on at all, but I think it would be really exciting to have another webinar specifically about that, because I think we could talk for a few more hours about where that's going. Although we do have 3 minutes left, and so I wanted to make sure that we're respecting everyone's time. Is there any final questions before we wrap up, or comments that anyone is feeling called to share?
I feel like I should share. I haven't actually contributed much. Apologies.
Hi, Flynn. We can hear you well now.
Great conversation. Yeah, well, I finally found a good zone here. So, yeah, really good conversation on the commodities, recycling. I see that the premium there is kind of the key, right? How do we really prescribe a premium? You know, it's interesting. I always do use the Apple case and see how much premium they were able to provide to their aluminum purchases, and so I guess maybe for kind of the last follow-up conversation, I think it's really going to be pricing, right? Who agrees with me on that? I mean, gold's 100% recycled almost because of the value of the metal. So do we just treat aluminum too low cost? Is that the kind of key? Or I guess I can add that comment.
I actually wanted to let you know that I went to the Eagles concert last week at the Scotiabank Center, and I was shocked and appalled to see that they've replaced all the plastic with aluminum. And then I thought about it. Plastic is not recyclable, but aluminum is, and that's why they're doing it. And there was no premium. And everybody was walking home with their beautiful stacks. So, you know, solo cups are gone, guys. We're doing beer pong with aluminum cups now. It's crazy.
They're doing that at the Bell Center in Montreal as well.
Yeah. And when you think about it, it's counterintuitive, but that aluminum will make it back into a product one day, and that plastic never will.
The aluminum is one of the few examples where there has been a premium. I mean, the deal that Rio Tinto did with Nespresso, I don't know what it is, but I know there's a premium behind it.
Well, that's good. Well, maybe there was a premium in our beer.
There's a possibility, there's an opportunity for this just based on supply and demand. There will be limited material accredited with quality standards for a while. And so those that really want it may end up having to pay a premium, but we'll see.
Yeah, I know the case with Apple, they pay about $7 for the aluminum in their laptop, so they can source a premium product, charge double, and it doesn't really affect the cost of the laptop, right? So
yeah, finding ways to do this. And Tony Jackson, thank you. He just shared, I'm so excited for the wave of cheap solar energy to move the economic set point on cost from single-use plastics to aluminum. Can't wait to buy milk in an aluminum bottle. So that's a great way to wrap up. We do have one last slide to show you before everyone hops off. So thank you to the team for showing this. We did want to highlight that there is a new initiative from the province of British Columbia called the ESG Center for Excellence. And it's a new support and resource hub for BC businesses and organizations. And they're providing a virtual concierge type client service that works with businesses one-on-one and at no cost to help them navigate their ESG journey. So we wanted to share this as a resource for anyone that's listening to the recording or calling in today live, that whether you're trying to understand what ESG is for your business, find ESG courses and training, or evaluate your own maturity and materiality, this is a great resource hub for you. There's a QR code here, and also their website, www.esgbc.ca. So invite you to go there and check that out. We will follow up with everybody, and there is a little poll here if you wouldn't mind exiting it. It helps us put on these events and get better at what we do. And just really a huge thank you to the panelists. I knew this was going to be a great chat, and you folks did not disappoint. Very, very grateful for your time and interest in being a part of our event today. Thank you so much.